Well, welcome guys. Thanks for having me here. Excited to do this for a second time. Well, Leslie asked me I asked Leslie what I should talk about, and he said, "What do you talk about? Chiropractic and consciousness." And I think it's a really interesting way to frame this for people, because this is not the way most people think about chiropractic, right? When you think of chiropractic, the last thing on your mind probably is consciousness for most people. So, just a photo
Is that
here.
a picture of you?
That is not me. That is D.D. Palmer. Daniel David Palmer. He was the first chiropractor. And
I think it was you.
you think it was me? Well, I decided I really wanted to give you guys a real context for, I think, chiropractic and the history of chiropractic philosophy, the history of chiropractic theory, history of the profession is a really fascinating exercise in understanding consciousness in our culture and the conflict between physicalism and a non-materialist approach to practice, to science, to healing. Let's see how this works. There we go. So, in the last few years, we've learned more about D.D. Palmer's life than in pretty much the history of chiropractic. And chiropractic history started as a discipline around 1980, and there's a journal that's been going that long, and there's a biography of his that came out about him that came out in the 80s. But just in the last few years, with internet archives and internet searches and databases, we've been able to go back and find all these old newspapers from the Midwest. And there's also some good historical archives around the country that have all this data. So we've learned more in the last 4 years about his life than we have in the previous 30 years of people writing on the topic. So he came down, let me show you a picture of him again so you can really get the context of this kind of rugged pioneer. He came down from Canada with his brother when he was about 18 or 19. I think he was 20 and his brother was 18. Their family had moved down. This was right after the Civil War, so this was in the 1860s. They came down from Canada. The family came down ahead of them, and D.D. and his brother Thomas decided to stay and finish their studies. They had a really harsh school taskmaster who really put them through a rigorous training in classics and languages. Then they came down, and the first thing that he did when he got to the States, the Midwest, was he became a school teacher. And he had a little schoolhouse, with the full range of students, right, from probably kindergarten through high school. In his journals from back then, which they still have, he had these little dictums to himself on how to teach, also some really interesting things on how to discipline kids. One of them included hanging them by their thumbs, which meant, if there was a third time abuser of lying, this was the final straw that would make them. I think really he threatened that. I don't know if but we don't know, right? But while he was there, he started studying spiritualism, which was really in vogue in American culture at the time. Catherine Albanese, in her book, The Republic of Mind and Spirit, she considered spiritualism as the third force in American religion during the 19th century. So we found recently that this was the journal that he was studying. It was the Religio Philosophical Journal. This is an 1872 edition. And a couple interesting things. One was, as he was kind of leaving teaching, he and his brother became beekeepers. They started their own beekeeping businesses in the 1860s. And there were these ads in the journal, I noticed, to the brother beekeepers, tips on how to be a good beekeeper. And he actually was an editor of the Beekeeper Journal. Recently a whole book came out. Somebody found all these old issues. Nobody knew that he was writing back then. But another classified ad right next to the beekeeper ad was this woman, Abelard, she was a soul reader. She would do that thing you used to see on the Ed Sullivan and on the Tonight Show. Karnak, right? Karnak, right. He'd take an envelope, put it next to his head, and tell you what was in the envelope. She would do this kind of thing with people. She would take a lock of hair. She would also do healing and diagnosis with people. So that's one thing, Abelard. I'll tell you more about her in a minute. Here's another ad from hers. The two of them got married. This was his first wife. And after they got married, her ads changed a little bit because you could see her early ads, and then they got married, and then her ads got a little more refined, and she changed her name to now Dr. Abelard Palmer. So people always wondered how D.D. Palmer just had the guts to one day start calling himself doctor. And it started with his wife. She started calling herself doctor. Another thing that we have in the Palmer archives, it's called the Palmer's Traveling Library. And these were a collection of books that he had bound together. These were found in a box on the Palmer campus in Davenport. And these were books on spiritualism, magnetic healing, and the philosophy of healing that were bound together. Some of them were pamphlets, some of them were books, and they have his name signed in them with years, like 1872, with his initials. And so I've had those for years. I even published a book a few years ago where I took those and abridged them for chiropractors to get a better understanding of the ideas and philosophy that influenced him. And then when I saw this new journal that I'd never seen before, it turns out that all of these books from his collection had ads in this journal. So this is where he was kind of getting his info. His earliest book he had was The Aphorisms of Confucius. He had these other books by Severance on philosophy of healing. He had these books by Denton on looking at the flood in the Bible scientifically. And this is how people were thinking back then. They were thinking of this really sort of critical look. So what Palmer did, and this is really cool, he found this young woman, Abelard, and this is a photo that I found of her from 1890. So this is 18 years later in San Francisco. She became a women's rights advocate and wrote a book on the Constitution and the women's right to vote. She left him after about 2 years. They had a little farm together, and she moved on, and we don't know much about her. A colleague of mine is working on a book on her. But we found this other amazing documents. This is from July 1872. D.D. Palmer wrote a testimonial to her in the journal as a letter to the editor. And in this, he talks about how they met. He talks about how he was on his path to become a minister, and then he became an atheist. So growing up, he thought he was going to be an Advent minister, or I think it was the Advent church. And then he became an atheist, and then he found spiritualism in these spiritualist meetings, and he decided this was a path for him. But he was still very skeptical. And when he sat down with her, his plan was to sit down and explain to her the facts of how this psychic stuff you think you're doing is not real. And then he saw her hit 10 diagnoses in a row correct. And he became a believer, fell in love. He even has their wedding vows in here. But then at the end, he writes this: I soon found I could put her in a mesmeric sleep, willing her to wake at any time desired by me, whether present or absent, and send her spirit or intelligence to any place, however distant, leaving it with her when to return, which was usually about 5 minutes, and then her apparently lifeless body would be reanimated, telling me more or less of what she had seen and heard while absent. These experiments have satisfied me that the spirit can and does leave the body and return. So this is 1872. And it's really interesting on a few levels. One is that he uses this term mesmeric sleep. So we really get these links that he was studying and learning mesmerism and magnetic healing way back in this time period. He also uses this term spirit or intelligence. And later, as he developed the philosophy of chiropractic, he coined the phrase universal intelligence and innate intelligence. And the innate intelligence is what organizes and governs the body, and it's a part and parcel of the universal intelligence that informs all matter. And chiropractors today are far more along the materialist side of the spectrum. Many of them still use these terms, but they don't really know how he originally used it way back in 1872. They use it today more in terms of like systems theory as the self-organizing, self-healing drive of the body, but not necessarily as the spirit that can move the body. So it's interesting to me to kind of really go back to the roots and see where these ideas originated from. So just a little bit more about his life. I won't hang out there too long. So he kind of moved on after she left him. He got remarried, had a couple of kids with the next wife, and then he moved to Watchir, Iowa, where his family was, and he opened a grocery store. And this was like pioneering times, right? That's around this time period, what this city looked like. And he had like the first dollar store, and he was bringing in fish from the Great Lakes and selling fish sandwiches. But all this time, he was really immersing himself in magnetic healing. So a few years later, this is now 1887, he starts calling himself doctor and opens up a magnetic healing practice. And he had this whole practice that he started to develop. And in these early ads, he says, I've been studying this stuff now for about 15 years or about 17 years. I just haven't applied it in practice yet, but now I'm actually applying it in practice. So he shows up in this little town in Burlington, Iowa, and he starts putting out these ads with testimonials. And these ads, too, we just recently found, and something really interesting from this ad, the very first line, he says, dis-ease is a condition of non-ease, lack of ease. And this theory of dis-ease was really a cornerstone of his whole healing paradigm. Decades later, chiropractors still use that term when they're talking about the philosophy of the chiropractic. It's sort of an overall lack of ease in the body, which in his sort of reality, that leads to pathophysiological processes. And overall dis-ease leads to pathophysiology. So this is really kind of central to his ideas. And to me, it's really fascinating because there's kind of the materialist stream in chiropractic where they're still talking about the innate intelligence as a self-organizing system. But then there's this solid materialist stream in chiropractic that wants to dismiss all of this. And since we haven't known so much over the last 30 years, the people writing the histories have been sort of shaping the way people talk about these philosophical ideas. Basically, the history is a mess, the historical papers and the literature. And for one example, there's even literature that has been coming out. Just last year, there was a peer-reviewed paper where someone suggested that this idea of dis-ease was just created in a legal case so that chiropractors can show that they're have a legal philosophy that's distinct from medicine. So I'm really interested in showing that these roots go back to even before he discovered chiropractic. So one other interesting side note that fits in with this sort of consciousness approach, this is another recent finding. People never knew in his biography from the 80s, they said, yeah, he moved from Burlington to Davenport. Nobody knows why. We now know why. There was this whole series of stories in the paper in October 1887 of a case, one of his first cases. It's a long story, but the woman was really ill after her pregnancy. Turns out something happened that kind of shocked her. I think the bed fell or something. And her sisters were avowed spiritualists. They were very, very immersed in the spiritualist culture. And they called D.D. Palmer in, and he comes in, and the woman was in like a trance state. And he said, oh, this is a case of spirit possession. And this is all in the court documents, in these newspaper stories. And he asked her, are you a spirit? And she said, yeah, my name is Bertha. And then there was another spirit who said, my name is Mercy. There's two of us here. And we'll be back in 2 weeks. And like, he had these conversations with them, and this was an ongoing thing. Then the woman stopped eating, and she went downhill, and she died on a Sunday. And they called Dr. Palmer in. And the sisters, my theory of it is that the sisters were so distraught, and they thought she was just in another deep trance, and they wanted to bring her back. So they were doing seances around her, and they kind of brought him in. I don't know if he was involved in the seances or not, but people were playing music. And not till 8 hours later did he sign a certificate that said, this is a dead person. So that's what got to the papers. This guy, because the medical doctors in these towns were on a crusade to drive these healers out of their city. So, and one of the ways they would get these healers was if they signed a death certificate and they didn't have a medical license. So then the coroners in the cities would go after them. So basically that's what they did. They called an inquisition of all the three local medical doctors, and they had an inquest, and all this is in the papers. And basically they said he was completely incompetent because he didn't know this was a dead body. I think this was his first dead body, and he was just trying to like be compassionate. But I don't really know the facts. That's my own take on it. So here he is around that time with his kids and his new wife. This is his third wife now. We think this is I think this is his fourth wife. He had another wife for a few months. Nobody knows about her. His son BJ is to his right. We'll talk about BJ in a minute. And then they move to Davenport. He starts putting out these advertisements that are just really amazing. And they've got his philosophy, his theories of immunization.
So they're not using magnets, right?
No, this was his theory. He would, and he really modified the magnetic healing of the day. And he kind of developed his own method, and he explains it in some of his writings. He starts putting out these like newspapers, like 4 or 5 pages with testimonials, with his little articles in it, explaining what magnetic healing was. And he said he would charge up his own energy. He would find the congested organ. He would palpate for a tender place, and then he would send his energy to that organ to break up the congestion. And his practice grew so big. He went from 3 rooms on the floor to the entire floor. They had rooms for patients to stay for weeks. It was really a booming practice. And then he developed chiropractic, because when he had this one janitor who was deaf, and he had the story where something fell and he had a vertebra out of place, and he put it back into place, and the guy got his hearing back. So he kind of linked his ideas together, and he started to realize that the congestion in that organ he was feeling was, he would palpate around to the spine. He called it nerve tracing. He would palpate the sensitive, painful areas to the spine, and then he decided that it was the misplacement of the vertebra causing an impingement on the nerve that would cause that congestion to happen. So he started, so around 1897, he really started teaching chiropractors. He still called it his School of Magnetic Cure, and he started putting out the chiropractic. And then he really started refining his ideas, because he was teaching chiropractors, and he was putting on their diplomas, you are now certified to practice and teach. So these guys in the Midwest would go out and open their own schools and start writing their own textbooks. And question?
Can you make up the name?
Chiropractic? No, actually he had, I think it was a Reverend Weed. I'm not sure, I was going to say Yale, but maybe Harvard, so I'm going to mess around. But Reverend Weed knew Greek, and he came up with a whole list of terms and came up with chiropraxis as done by hand, and Dee Dee liked it. So around the same time period, he starts really refining his ideas. And in this photo, he wrote on the bottom, in 1902, we saw over 11,000 patients. So he was really busy. So like in the crucible of teaching, this is some of his students from 1902, in the crucible of teaching, practicing, and trying to refine and explain theory, because he didn't really teach much. It was more like an apprentice program. You'd come into my clinic, watch me for somewhere between 4 to 6 weeks, maybe 6 months if you were really serious. Some of these guys were already osteopaths or medical doctors, so they didn't need as much training. And then he would send them on their way, and then some of these guys, like Langworthy here with the mustache, he opened his own school in Cedar Rapids, Iowa, and started his own journal called Backbone and said, yeah, this chiropractic thing's been around a long time. D.D. Palmer probably learned it from the local Bohemians who had been doing this for centuries. So they tried to sort of displace him as the founder of this thing from the very beginning. So he had this real social impact, legal, educational, he had a lot of impacts on him to really start to say, hey, this is mine, these are my theories. So he started writing quite a bit. So this one ad in 1902 is when he coins this term innate intelligence. And he first described it as the way the body naturally adapts to the environment and like the stressors. Like if you put a lot of pressure on bones, they start to develop osteophytes, like that as just a natural innate response to the pressures of the environment. And then he starts to really develop his theories. He put out his own journal that came out every month now, starting in 1904. And then his wife died in 1905, and he put out an article called Immortality. And this is the first time he really starts to write about more esoteric topics. And I think of it almost like a eulogy he wrote to his wife. It came out right after she died. This is when he coined the term universal intelligence. And when you look at it, like I found an old spiritualist manual from the 1890s, and you open it up and it says, we believe in an infinite intelligence as their main premise. So you can see how his ideas really kind of developed from these concepts. So 2 books came out, 1906, 1910. The 1910 book is really considered his tome. And these were really the collections of all the articles he was writing at this time, where he was really developing the theory, developing his ideas. And it wasn't just like spiritualist stuff, he was also really trying to study science. He really wanted it to be known as a science. So his main theory was that the articulations of the spine would be subluxated, which would be a slight misalignment, which would impinge on the nerve, which is kind of like, if you think of like a string going across a violin bridge. The bridge is impinging on the nerve. And he said that would irritate the nerve, and vibrationally it would change the vibration of the nerve. So the information would either be too much or not enough, which would change the function of the organs and cause this change in the tone of the whole system, and then it would cause abnormal function. So he's really a forward-thinking like individual in many respects, because he really thought that this affected not only this life, but it affected the life after. He felt that if you can align your spine and allow this energy to move through your nervous system, you would evolve in the next life as well. So he really felt that this was part of this really evolutionary idea. And he also really wanted to understand kind of a dynamic approach. So this one historian, Gaucher Pesserby, he did his PhD in the 90s at this prestigious history of medicine program in France. I forget the name. And Gaucher looked at what was he studying scientifically, how did he fit in with the history of these ideas and the history of medicine. And one thing he found was, by looking at his medical and scientific references, then Gaucher looked at, within a 100-mile radius, what were all the medical students studying at that time. And he found that Palmer was not only up on the latest texts, but he was able to cite the latest editions and go back 2 or 3 editions in some cases. So he's really a self-taught anatomist and physiologist. So for me, in my history of background, I like to look at this in terms of, what are the roots in Western theory. So this also comes from Gaucher, and he traces back from Mesmer down through these other theories. And the guys on the bottom, of course, we've got Charcot, who's the famous French neurologist. And he said Charcot found the patient to be a package of flesh and bones. Freud came from that same lineage, and he found the patient to be a package of neuroses. And Palmer found the patient to be a package of tensions. So that's Gaucher's take on it. And I think of it really in terms of this whole sort of lineage of Western thought, especially in terms of the Neoplatonic tradition and some of the later Vitalists, Bruno, Augustine. The frame that I've been really looking at this through is really from Wilber's integral framework, Taylor's senses of the self, and then Gebser's idea of the structures of consciousness. Because to me, I want to understand, who was this individual in terms of this self within the modern world confronting the challenges of modernity and the turn of the last century. Because really the spiritualism was so in vogue at that time because this was right after the Civil War when 100,000 Americans had died. So people were really seeking ways to connect with the beyond. So it was this real sort of cultural moment, plus they were facing all these sort of what Wilber calls the disasters of modernity. So this chart comes from Wilber, and he sort of takes it from Kant, and he suggests that the modern world, the real conflict is the modern world really has kind of split these value spheres of truth, goodness, and beauty. And the challenge of sort of the postmodern world, or what Gebser calls the integral perspective, aperspectival world, is how can we start to integrate these. And I think in Palmer's philosophy it starts to do this. It's this real non-materialist approach, but it's a real paradigm that's also based in scientific validity, objective truth, and it really comes through these different streams. So when you think of it in terms of Mesmer, like spiritualism in the United States was really a combination of Mesmer's ideas and Swedenborg's ideas. And these guys were both post-Enlightenment thinkers. Gabay refers to them as the counter-enlightenment, or no, he calls it, his book's called the covert enlightenment. So this was a response to the Enlightenment, where Swedenborg had these sort of visionary states, and Mesmer had this kind of cosmology, right, that there's this energetic ether that we can channel through our bodies. So spiritualism in America became this way to sort of connect to these spiritual states, where Swedenborg referred to as heaven, through this energetic sort of connection. So it really comes from this whole sort of lineage. So just to kind of sum up some of his ideas, and then I'll give you a little bit more of how I'm applying this today to the chiropractic profession. So he really takes these early elements, really I think of this as sort of early systems thinking. And like Gaucher was putting him in context of like Bergson and Kandinsky, some of the early thinkers that were kind of bringing spirit and science together. 2 minutes, okay. So I'll give you just a couple more then. So the way I like to frame it is, this is from Suzanne Cook-Reuter, and these are different models of how the self develops. So this first one over here is sort of the conformist self, right? Where I'm in the middle and everybody who's good is in my circle. And then as you develop and you start to develop a third person perspective, you can say, okay, I'm over here, you and me are over there. That's what she calls the expert. And then the rationalist, real materialist thinker is the one who can say, okay, here's me, and then here's you and me in the past, you and me in the future. This is more of a rational, scientific thinker can take this third person perspective. And then the early systems thinker, what Wilber refers to as the me, is when you can start to take a fourth person perspective. So for Palmer, it was the chiropractic adjustment should clear out the penitentiaries and the jails. He found this was a global effect in the organism, in the system, but as the nervous system would get more coherent, then insanity would decrease, crime would decrease. So I think of it as a challenge to like his students, right? Because he was thinking from this more fourth-person perspective, and now he's got students who are coming in. Some of them maybe were medical doctors. Most of them were barely high school graduates. And then they're integrating this kind of early systems approach, bringing spirit and matter and science together in a practice, which is pretty advanced. So a history of chiropractic has been sort of a struggle between these levels or perspectives on consciousness. And it's probably around the 1970s these guys really won. They took over the academic accreditation standards. It's another long story which I've written a bit about. But I think the streams of chiropractic, and there's sort of a minority today in the profession who still look to these ideas in a real valuable way, but they've been sort of dismissed.
Are you in that group?
No, sort of, yeah. I'm sort of on the edge of that, bringing them along. So for me, it's really fascinating, and like my mentor, Donnie Epstein, he's recently developed a model that takes this, his original idea of, say, innate intelligence, the educated intelligence, and the universal intelligence, and broke them down into 6 levels that he calls the energetic intelligences. And we've been sort of using that as a practical model. And just to get the context of how this sort of lineage has been passed down, I'll never forget, I was studying with Donnie one day, and he wanted to show me this certain feeling, right? Because that's really the key to this sort of embodied approach, and what this feeling felt in the tissues. And he just took my hand and he put it on his wrist, and he said, no, not there, not there. We went a little deeper into the actual tissues, and he went there, and I felt this whole light fill me, and my eyes popped, and I was like, oh, that's what you're talking about. And to me, it was like, that's the innate intelligence. Like we can access it through touch. So this is beyond this kind of just like theoretical model that's been passed down. There's been this communication through touch from teacher to student. I'll just show you this one of these last slides here. And I've been just tracking over the sort of generation since D.D. Palmer, kind of where these ideas have sort of morphed to from his students and their students. There's me down here somewhere. And just trying to understand, how this profession got to this mess that it's in today, and how the roots are really this really non-materialist paradigm with a very physicalist approach to bring forth the injunction of the paradigm. Cool stuff, huh?
I love it. I gave you that.